the horizon is not merely a line where the earth meets the sky. In the American West of 1866, it was a frontier of infinite silence and brutal possibility. Imagine a landscape so vast that the human ego shrinks to the size of a single grain of dust. Here, the wind does not just blow, it speaks in the hushed tones of 1,000 miles of untouched tall grass. This is the stage upon which one of history's most enduring myths was forged. But before the celluloid heroes and the romanticized ballads, there was only the grit, the heat, and the relentless sun. The story of the cowboy is not a tale of effortless glory, but a narrative written in sweat, leather, and the rhythmic thud of 1,000,000 hooves against the sun-baked earth. It is a story born from the ashes of a divided nation, emerging from the shadows of the Civil War into a light so bright it blinded those who looked too closely. To understand the cowboy, one must first understand the silence of the prairie, a silence that demanded a specific kind of man, a specific kind of resilience, and a willingness to disappear into the great American desert. In the years following the surrender at Appomattox, the United States was a country searching for its soul and its survival. While the East rebuilt its cities and the South nursed its wounds, the vast expanses of Texas held a secret that would soon change the economic destiny of the continent. Millions of wild cattle, the long-horned descendants of Spanish stock, had multiplied in the brush country during the war years. They were a resource without a market, a wealth that had no way to reach the hungry mouths of the industrializing North. It was here, in the necessity of movement, that the era of the great cattle drives began. The cowboy was not born out of a desire for adventure, but out of a desperate economic vacuum. He was at his core a seasonal laborer, a migrant worker on horseback, tasked with an impossible mission to move thousands of stubborn, frightened animals across a landscape that was often as hostile as it was beautiful. The myth tells us he was a knight of the plains, but the reality was a man covered in a layer of dust so thick it became a second skin. This was a world defined by the vertical and the horizontal. The vertical was the scorching sun and the sudden, violent thunderstorms that could turn a dry creek bed into a raging river in minutes. The horizontal was the trail, the Chisholm, the Goodnight, Loving, the Western. Paths etched into the dirt by the collective will of men and beasts. As we look back through the fog of time, we see the silhouette of a rider against a setting sun, but if we look closer, we see the exhaustion in his shoulders. We see the way his eyes are permanently creased from squinting against the glare. We see the horse, an animal that was less a pet and more an extension of the man's own body. Without the horse, the man was a ghost. With it, he was a king of the open range. The relationship between the rider and his mount was the most sacred bond in the West, a partnership of mutual survival where a single misstep meant a broken limb or a lonely death in the wilderness. The cowboy was a mosaic of cultures and backgrounds, a truth often ignored by the history books of old. He was the young boy from a ruined southern plantation looking for a new start. He was the formerly enslaved man finding a different kind of freedom in the anonymity of the trail. He was the vaquero, the original master of the rope and the saddle, whose vocabulary and techniques provided the very foundation of the trade. They came together in a symphony of different languages and shared hardships, united by the singular goal of reaching the railhead. The air they breathed was filled with the smell of sagebrush, wood smoke, and the overwhelming musk of the herd. To live this life was to accept a profound loneliness. Days would pass with no sound but the lowing of cattle and the jingle of spurs. It was a life of solitude interrupted by moments of sheer, heart-stopping terror. The sudden crack of thunder that triggers a stampede, the hidden rattlesnake in the grass, or the quiet tension of crossing territories where they were not welcome. As the sun dips below the jagged peaks of the Rockies, the campfire becomes the center of the universe. In this small circle of flickering light, the harshness of the day softened into stories and songs. These were not the polished performances of a theater, but raw, haunting melodies that served a practical purpose: to calm the nervous cattle in the dead of night. The cowboy's voice was a tool, a low hum against the darkness, a way to remind the animals that a friend was near. This intimacy with nature and beast created a unique psychology, a stoicism that would eventually define the American character. They were men who spoke little because the wind drowned out most words anyway. They were men who valued action over rhetoric and loyalty over law. The code of the West was not written in books. It was understood in the way a man held his ground and the way he treated his horse. But the world was changing even as the first trails were being blazed. The very success of the cattle industry sowed the seeds of its eventual decline. The arrival of the railroad meant that the long, grueling drives would one day be obsolete. The invention of barbed wire would soon slice the open range into manageable squares, choking the freedom that the cowboy represented. But for a brief, shining window of 3 decades, the West belonged to the rider. It was a time when the map was still being drawn, when the fences had not yet arrived, and when a man could ride for weeks without seeing a single soul. This is the era we seek to uncover, the bridge between the old world and the modern age. It is a story of survival, of a unique culture born from the dirt, and of a legacy that continues to gallop through our collective imagination long after the last trail has been paved over. We begin our journey here, in the dust of the Texas brush, following the first hoofprints of a legend. The movement of 1,000 cattle is not a chaotic scramble. It is a slow, deliberate migration that requires the precision of a military campaign and the patience of a saint. To the casual observer, the great cattle drives of the 1870s might have looked like a simple matter of pointing animals north. But in reality, it was a complex dance of human grit and animal instinct. The process began with the roundup, a grueling period of scouring the thickets and canyons of South Texas to gather the wild longhorns that had spent the winter hiding in the brush. These were not the docile cows of the modern farm. These were lean, muscular, and incredibly temperamental beasts with horns that could span 6 feet from tip to tip. Once gathered, the herd had to be trail broken, taught to follow a lead and move as a single, cohesive unit. This was the moment the cowboy's true work began, stepping into a hierarchy where every man had a specific place and a vital responsibility. At the head of this dusty procession was the trail boss, the man who carried the weight of the entire enterprise on his shoulders. He was the navigator, the diplomat, and the law. He rode ahead to scout for water and grass, negotiate with landowners, and sense the shifts in the weather before they became life-threatening. Behind him, at the very front of the herd, were the point riders. These were the most experienced hands, tasked with setting the pace and direction. They were the conductors of the symphony, guiding the lead steers, who in turn guided the rest of the masses. Behind them came the swing and flank riders, responsible for keeping the herd from fanning out too wide and ensuring that stragglers were pushed back into the flow. And then there was the drag. This was the most unenviable position on the trail, occupied by the greenest hands or those being punished. The drag riders rode at the very back, where the air was a thick, suffocating curtain of pulverized earth kicked up by thousands of hooves. To ride the drag was to breathe dirt for 14 hours a day, a job that left a man's face unrecognizable by sundown. Central to this mobile world was the chuckwagon, the invention of Charles Goodnight and the undisputed heart of the camp. It was more than just a kitchen on wheels. It was the cowboy's only home, his pharmacy, and his social club. The man who ran it, often called Cookie, was the most important person on the drive, second only to the trail boss. He was typically an older cowboy whose body could no longer handle the rigors of the saddle, but whose spirit remained as iron-clad as his cast iron pots. Cookie woke long before the sun, his fire the first spark of light in the vast darkness of the plains. He prepared the cowboy's trinity of biscuits, bacon, and coffee, liquid black gold that provided the caffeine necessary to endure the day. The chuckwagon was where the men gathered at night to repair their gear, share quiet jokes, and find a brief moment of civilization in a landscape that felt entirely prehistoric. The trail was a gauntlet of natural hazards that tested the limits of human endurance. Perhaps the most feared of all was the river crossing. To a cowboy, a river was not a scenic vista, but a potential graveyard. The Red River, the Arkansas, the Plata. These were formidable barriers that could turn into death traps in an instant. A sudden rise in the water level, or a hidden patch of quicksand, could swallow a dozen cattle and their riders in a heartbeat. The cowboys had to swim their horses alongside the herd, shouting and splashing to keep the cattle moving toward the opposite bank, all while praying that the current wouldn't sweep them into a tangle of debris. There was no room for hesitation. Once the herd was committed to the water, the only way out was through. The adrenaline of the crossing was often followed by the shivering cold of a night spent in wet clothes, a reminder that the environment was always the ultimate master. Even when the rivers were calm, the sky could become an enemy. The Great Plains are the birthplace of some of the most violent weather on the planet. A summer afternoon could start with a blistering heat that made the air shimmer, only to end in a terrifying display of lightning and hail. For a cowboy, a thunderstorm was not just an inconvenience. It was the spark for the ultimate nightmare, the stampede. Cattle are naturally skittish, and the sudden crack of thunder or a stray bolt of lightning could send 3,000 animals into a blind, crushing panic in an instant. The peaceful lowing of the herd would turn into a thunderous roar as thousands of tons of meat and bone charged into the darkness. To stop a stampede, cowboys had to ride at a breakneck gallop in the middle of the night, trying to get to the front of the herd to turn the leaders into a circle. It was a suicidal maneuver performed on uneven ground filled with prairie dog holes and hidden ravines, where a single stumble by the horse meant a certain and grisly end for the rider. The monotony of the trail was as exhausting as its dangers. Day after day, the scenery remained a repetitive canvas of grass and sky. The diet was repetitive, the conversations grew thin, and the physical toll became a constant ache. Yet, there was a strange, meditative quality to this life. The cowboy became hyper-aware of his surroundings, learning to read the tilt of a steer's ear or the way the wind shifted before a storm. He developed a deep, silent communication with his horse, a partnership where the animal often knew what to do before the man even pulled the reins. This was a life of extreme contrasts, long stretches of boredom punctuated by minutes of sheer life or death intensity. It was in these moments that the cowboy's identity was truly forged. Not in the glamorous shootouts of fiction, but in the quiet persistence of moving a herd 1 mile further toward the horizon. As the weeks turned into months, the toll on the men and animals became visible. Ribs began to show on the horses, and the cowboys' clothing grew tattered and stained with the colors of the earth. But as they neared the railheads, towns like Abilene, Ellsworth, or Dodge City, the atmosphere in the camp began to shift. The prospect of a hot bath a warm meal that didn't come out of a Dutch oven, and the arrival of their hard-earned wages provided a second wind. They were approaching the end of a journey that had tested every fiber of their being. They had survived the thirst, the dust, the storms, and the rivers. They were the masters of the long drive, the men who had successfully bridged the gap between the wild pastures of Texas and the hungry markets of the East. But as the lights of the cattle town appeared on the horizon, they knew that their victory was temporary, for the trail always called them back, and the cycle of the West would begin all over again. To the uninitiated, the silhouette of a cowboy is often mistaken for a costume of vanity, a collection of leather and felt designed for cinematic flair. But in the harsh reality of the 19th century frontier, every stitch of clothing and every piece of hardware was a hard-won lesson in survival. There was no room for the superfluous. A cowboy's gear was his life support system, a specialized toolkit developed through trial and error in an environment that offered no second chances. If a piece of equipment did not serve a vital purpose, it was discarded. What remained was a lean, functional ensemble that defined a man's capability and his status. To understand the man, one must understand the tools he carried, for they were the only things standing between him and a lonely grave in the sagebrush. The most expensive and vital possession any cowboy owned was not his horse, which usually belonged to the ranch, but his saddle. It was his office, his workbench, and at night, his pillow. A good saddle could cost more than several months' wages, and a man would sooner part with his boots than his seat. This was not merely a chair on horseback. It was a complex piece of engineering designed to distribute the rider's weight evenly over the horse's back, allowing both to endure 16-hour days of constant movement. The high pommel and the sturdy cantle provided security during a sudden burst of speed or a violent buck, while the heavy wooden horn at the front served as an anchor. When a cowboy roped a 1,000-pound steer, that horn became the fulcrum of a high-stakes tug of war. The bond between the man and his saddle was so deep that the phrase, "to sell one's saddle," became synonymous with utter failure and the abandonment of the trade. Moving from the seat of power to the head of the rider, we find the most iconic symbol of the West, the wide-brimmed hat. While the legendary John B. Stetson popularized the boss of the plains, the hat was far more than a cultural marker. It was a portable shelter. Its broad brim acted as a personal umbrella during torrential downpours and a vital shield against the blistering sun that could peel the skin off a man's face in a single afternoon. In the dry reaches of the desert, it served as a vessel to carry water to a thirsty horse or a fan to coax a flickering campfire into a blaze. The tucks and folds in a man's hat often told the story of where he was from and the specific weather he faced. It was the first thing he put on in the morning and the last thing he took off at night, a constant companion in a world of variables. Around his neck, the cowboy wore a simple piece of silk or cotton known as the bandana or neckerchief. In the romanticized versions of the West, it is often seen as a colorful accessory. But on the trail, it was the cowboy's most versatile tool. When riding the drag behind a herd, it was pulled up over the nose and mouth to act as a rudimentary respirator against the suffocating clouds of dust. It could become a bandage for a wound, a sling for a broken arm, a potholder for a hot coffee pot, or a makeshift blindfold for a nervous horse. The salt-crusted, sweat-stained bandana was a testament to the grit of the journey, a small square of fabric that performed 100 different tasks without complaint. Below the waist, the cowboy was armored in leather. The heavy leggings known as chaps, derived from the Spanish chaparras, were essential for anyone navigating the thorny brush of Texas or the jagged landscapes of the mountains. Without them, a rider's trousers would be shredded and his legs bloodied by the relentless mesquite, cactus, and scrub oak. These leather guards also provided a layer of insulation against the biting winter winds and a degree of protection if a horse were to fall or a steer were to strike out, coupled with his boots, which featured high heels to prevent the foot from slipping through the stirrup, and pointed toes for quick mounting. The cowboy was built for the saddle. The spurs on his heels were not instruments of cruelty, but sophisticated tools of communication. A subtle jingle or a light touch told the horse exactly what was required. A language of iron and instinct that allowed for precision movement in the heat of a roundup. Then there was the rope, the lariat, or arita, the true symbol of the cowboy's skill. Made of braided rawhide or twisted hemp, the rope was an extension of the man's own arm. To master the lariat was to master the wild. It required years of practice to be able to throw a loop over the horns of a charging animal while galloping across uneven ground. The rope was used for everything from catching a fresh mount in the morning to dragging firewood to the camp or securing a calf for branding. It was a silent, lethal, and incredibly effective tool that required no ammunition and never jammed. A cowboy who was handy with a rope earned the respect of his peers, for it was the ultimate test of coordination and nerve. No discussion of cowboy gear would be complete without the mention of firearms, though the reality often diverged from the legends. The Colt revolver and the Winchester rifle were indeed present, but they were rarely used for the dramatic duels seen in fiction. To a working cowboy, a gun was a tool of last resort and a defense against the natural world. It was there to protect the herd from predators like wolves or cougars, to signal for help in a vast wilderness, or, in the most tragic circumstances, to put down a horse with a broken leg. The weight of a heavy gun belt was often an encumbrance during a long day of physical labor, and many cowboys kept their primary weapons in their bedrolls or scabbards rather than on their hips. The gunfighter was a rare breed. The working hand was a man who used his wits and his rope far more often than his trigger. Even his clothing reflected the need for practicality over style. The vest was popular not for its look, but for its pockets, since a man sitting in a saddle could not easily reach into his trouser pockets. The vest provided a place to keep tobacco, matches, and a pocket watch. The lack of a collar on his shirts prevented chafing during the constant movement of his neck. Every element was a calculated choice. This ensemble of leather, wool, and steel created a unique sensory experience. The creak of the saddle, the jingle of spurs, the smell of oiled rawhide, and the scratch of heavy denim. It was a uniform of industry, a shell that protected the vulnerable human form from a landscape that seemed determined to break it. As we look at the weathered gear of a 19th century cowboy, we see the echoes of a life lived entirely outdoors. We see the repairs made with bits of wire and string, the smooth spots on the leather where hands have gripped for decades, and the dents in the felt of the hat. These objects were not merely possessions. They were the physical manifestation of a man's identity. When a cowboy stood on the open range, fully equipped, he was a self-contained unit of survival, a human being who had engineered his way into a world where he didn't naturally belong. This was the true genius of the West, the ability to take simple materials, skin, wood, and iron, and turn them into a legacy that would outlast the men who wore them. The silver screen has often painted the American West in a single, monochromatic hue, presenting a myth of the lone white rider as the sole architect of the frontier. But if we could peel back the layers of Hollywood fiction and stand on the dusty streets of Abilene in 1875, we would witness a far more complex and vibrant tapestry of humanity. The reality of the cattle trail was not a closed circle of a single race. It was one of the most diverse and integrated labor forces in the history of the young nation. This was a world where necessity often trumped prejudice, and where the ability to handle a horse or a rope mattered more than the color of a man's skin or the language of his birth. To look at the cowboy is to look at a mosaic of cultures: African American, Mexican, indigenous, and European, all fused together by the heat of the sun and the demands of the herd. Long before the first American pioneer crossed the Mississippi, the foundations of the cattle industry were being laid by the vaquero. These Mexican horsemen were the true masters of the craft, the original architects of the cowboy way of life. They had been refining the art of open range ranching for centuries in the arid landscapes of northern Mexico and California. It was the vaquero who perfected the design of the heavy stock saddle, the use of the lariat, and the sophisticated techniques of cattle management. In fact, the very language of the cowboy is a phonetic echo of Spanish heritage. Words like rodeo come from rodear, to surround. Lariat is a corruption of lariata, and even the quintessential a buckaroo is a linguistic evolution of vaquero itself. These men were the elite professionals of the plains, often hired by Texas ranchers to teach the raw, inexperienced recruits from the East how to survive. To ignore the vaquero is to ignore the DNA of the West. They provided the rhythm and the rules for everything that followed. Parallel to the rise of the vaquero was the vital, often overlooked presence of the African-American cowboy. Following the cataclysm of the Civil War, thousands of formerly enslaved men headed west, seeking a life that offered a different kind of freedom. In the East and the South, the chains of Jim Crow were tightening. But on the trail, the demands of the cattle drive created a strange and temporary meritocracy. It is estimated that at least 1 in 4 cowboys was black. These men were not just laborers. They were often the most skilled breakers of wild horses and the most trusted hands on the drive. For a black man in the 1870s, the range offered a level of social mobility and autonomy that was virtually impossible to find elsewhere. In the saddle, a man was judged by his stamina, his courage during a stampede, and his loyalty to the outfit, while they still faced systemic racism and were rarely promoted to the position of trail boss. Their contributions were the backbone of the cattle economy. They were the silent experts, the riders who held the line when the storms broke and the world turned to chaos. The West was also a frontier for the European immigrant, the dreamer who had crossed an ocean only to find the crowded tenements of New York or Chicago suffocating. Irish, German, and Scandinavian faces were common among the trail crews, men who traded the familiar green hills of their homelands for the endless brown grass of the plains. They brought with them their own songs and traditions, which slowly bled into the campfire culture of the cowboy. This mixing of backgrounds created a unique social contract, the Code of the West. It was an unwritten set of rules that prioritized action over words. It didn't matter where you came from. It mattered that you stayed with the herd. It mattered that you shared your water when the canteens were low. This shared hardship forged a bond that transcended the social barriers of the time, creating a brotherhood of the trail that was as iron-clad as the brands on the cattle. And then there were the women. History often relegates the women of the West to the roles of the stoic pioneer wife or the glamorous saloon girl, but the truth is far more rugged. While the cattle trail was a predominantly male environment, women were far from absent. There were female ranch owners, like Lizzie Johnson Williams, known as the Cattle Queen of Texas, who drove her own herds up the Chisholm Trail and managed her finances with a sharpness that intimidated many of her male counterparts. There were women who dressed in men's clothing to find work on the range, choosing the hard life of a rider over the limited domestic options of the 19th century. These women possessed a grit that was forged in the same fires as the men. They fought off predators, managed the books of massive enterprises, and endured the same crushing loneliness of the plains. Their presence reminds us that the West was not just a playground for men, but a laboratory for a new kind of independence that would eventually fuel the movement for women's suffrage. The social hierarchy of a cattle outfit was functional rather than aristocratic. At the top was the owner, often a distant figure living in a growing city, but the real power lay with the trail boss. Below him, the experienced hands were respected elders of the craft, while the greenhorns, or buttons, were the apprentices, learning through exhaustion and mockery. Yet even the lowest hand was a part of the outfit. This word, outfit, carried a heavy weight. It referred not just to the equipment, but to the collective identity of the group. To belong to an outfit was to have a family in a land where your biological family might be 2,000 miles away. This sense of belonging was the only thing that made the 3-month long journeys bearable. This diversity also extended to the interactions with indigenous peoples. The trails often cut through the lands of the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Cheyenne. The relationship was not always the constant warfare depicted in pulp novels, but a complex series of negotiations, tolls, and cultural exchanges. Many Native Americans worked as scouts or even as cowboys themselves, bringing their unparalleled knowledge of the terrain and animal behavior to the industry. The West was a meeting ground, a place where different ways of seeing the world collided and, occasionally, found a way to coexist under the vast, indifferent sky. As we look at the faces in the fading sepia photographs of the era, we see a cross-section of the world. We see the high cheekbones of the indigenous scout, the weathered, dark skin of the former slave, the mustache of the Mexican vaquero, and the light eyes of the European immigrant. They are all covered in the same gray dust. They all wear the same salt-stained hats. In the end, the cattle didn't care about the lineage of the man who drove them, and the blizzard didn't care about the language he used to curse the cold. The West was a brutal equalizer, a place where the diversity of the crew was a strategic advantage, ensuring that a variety of skills and perspectives were available to solve the endless problems of the trail. This was the true social fabric of the frontier, a fragile, hard-fought unity born of the realization that out here, on the edge of the world, no man could survive alone. After months of navigating the desolate prairies and the unpredictable elements, the appearance of a cattle town on the horizon felt less like a destination and more like a fever dream. To a cowboy who had heard nothing but the lowing of cattle and the whistle of the wind for 90 days. The distant lights of Abilene, Wichita, or Dodge City represented a sensory explosion. These were the wickedest cities in the West. Born almost overnight out of the intersection of the trail and the iron rail, they were places of frantic commerce and desperate release, where the dust of the trail met the sawdust of the saloon floor. But the popular image of these towns as lawless arenas of constant gunfights and daily funerals is a shadow of the truth. The reality of the cattle town was a delicate, often tense balance between the need for profit and the necessity of order. It was an economic engine fueled by cattle, but lubricated by whiskey, gambling, and the hard-earned wages of exhausted men. As the herd was penned and the cowboy finally received his pay, perhaps $80 or $100 in gold, the transformation began. The first stop was almost always the barber shop for a shave and a hot bath, a luxury that stripped away the literal layers of the trail. New clothes were bought, and the tattered rags of the journey were tossed into the street. Only then was the cowboy ready to face the distractions of the town. The cattle town was a place of extreme contrasts. On one side of the tracks, the business of the railroad and the shipping yards hummed with industrial efficiency. On the other side, the plaza, or Texas Street, offered a gauntlet of temptations. The air was thick with the sound of tuned pianos, the clatter of poker chips, and the boisterous laughter of men who had forgotten what it felt like to be under a roof. It is here, in the smoke-filled saloons, that the myth of the American gunfighter was born. Pulp novels and later Hollywood westerns created a vision of the West where disputes were settled by a lightning fast draw at high noon. In reality, the quick draw duel was an exceedingly rare occurrence. Most violence in the West was far less cinematic. It was the result of too much cheap whiskey and short tempers occurring in dark alleys or over a messy card table. The famous showdown was a narrative device rather than a daily reality. In fact, many of the most famous cattle towns had stricter gun control laws than most modern American cities. Upon entering the city limits, a cowboy was often required to turn over his firearms to the local marshal or sheriff, receiving a claim check in return. To be caught packing iron within the town was to risk a heavy fine or a night in a cramped wooden jail cell. The town leaders, while happy to take the cowboys' money, were terrified that excessive violence would scare away the legitimate investors and the railroad magnates who held the keys to the town's future. This brings us to the legendary figures of Western law, men like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Bat Masterson. In the history books, they are often portrayed as stainless champions of justice. In reality, they were complex, often morally ambiguous men who frequently drifted between the sides of the law. A marshal was often a businessman as much as a peace officer. Many owned interests in the very saloons and gambling halls they were tasked with policing. Their job was not to eliminate vice, but to contain it. They were essentially high-stakes bouncers, hired to ensure that the rowdy element didn't burn the town down or drive away the respectable citizens. Wild Bill Hickok, with his flowing hair and twin ivory, handled revolvers, was a master of intimidation who preferred to settle disputes with his reputation rather than his trigger finger. When he did use his guns, it was with a cold, calculated efficiency that left little room for the romanticism of a fair fight. The violence that did occur was often a byproduct of the Texas vs. the law dynamic. The cowboys, mostly young Southerners, with a lingering resentment from the Civil War, viewed the Northern lawmen and town marshals with deep suspicion. To them, the no guns ordinances were an insult to their manhood and their heritage. This friction created a constant, low-level tension that occasionally boiled over into famous confrontations. But even the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral, the most famous shootout in Western history, lasted less than 30 seconds and was sparked as much by political rivalries and cattle-rustling disputes as it was by law enforcement. Most cowboys never fired their pistols at another human being in their entire lives. The weight of the gun on their hip was a tool of the trade and a symbol of their status. But the actual act of killing was a heavy, messy business that most sought to avoid. The economy of these towns was built on a vice tax. Since the cattle industry was seasonal, the towns had to make their entire year's revenue in the few months the trails were active. They did this by licensing saloons, gambling tables, and brothels. The soiled doves of the red light districts were an integral, if marginalized, part of this ecosystem. These women were often the most independent and economically savvy individuals in the town, navigating a harsh world with a resilience that matched any trail hand. The cattle town was a temporary society, a boom and bust cycle that repeated every summer. When the last train departed with the last steer, the music stopped. The saloons boarded up their windows, and the town returned to a ghostly quiet, waiting for the spring thaws to bring the next wave of dust and dollars. As we look past the swinging doors of the saloon and the legend of the Silver Star, we see that the cattle towns were the first true, urban experiences for many of these rural men. They were the places where the wildness of the frontier was forced to reckon with the encroaching hand of civilization, the arrival of churches, schools, and respectable. Women soon followed the saloons, and with them came a push for permanent order. The very marshals who were hired to keep the peace were eventually replaced by more bureaucratic forms of government. The Wild West was being tamed not by the gun, but by the ordinance, the tax, and the railroad schedule. By the late 1880s, The era of the great cattle towns was already beginning to fade. The trails were shifting further west as the farmers moved in, and the railroads were extending their reach directly into Texas. The legendary Dodge City and Abilene began to transition from centers of vice to centers of agriculture. The cowboy, once the king of the Texas street, found himself increasingly unwelcome in the towns he had helped build. The myth of the gunfighter remained, growing larger with every retelling in the penny press of the East. But the men who actually wore the stars and the men who actually rode the trails knew better. They knew that the West was won not by a single bullet, but by the relentless, grinding march of commerce and the quiet determination of men who were simply trying to survive another day in the dust. The tragedy of the open range was not that it failed, but that it was too successful for its own survival. By the early 1880s, the vast, unfenced stretches of the American West had become an international investment bubble. Money poured in from the East Coast and from across the Atlantic as Scottish and English syndicates sought to capitalize on what seemed like free grass and endless profit. The plains were becoming overcrowded, not with people, but with millions of hungry mouths. The ecosystem was being pushed to its breaking point, and the very freedom that defined the cowboy's life was about to be strangled by a simple, twisted strand of steel. This was the era of the devil's rope, barbed wire, invented by Joseph Glidden in 1874. This modest invention did more to tame the West than any lawman's gun or railroad engine. It was cheap, effective, and final for the cowboy who viewed the horizon as his only boundary. The appearance of the first fence was a death knell for a way of life that had lasted only a generation. As the homesteaders, or nesters, arrived in increasing numbers, they used barbed wire to protect their small plots of land from the roaming herds. Conflict was inevitable. The range wars broke out. Clandestine struggles fought in the dead of night where cowboys, desperate to keep the trails open, would cut miles of wire, only to find them replaced the next morning. These were not just battles over property. They were battles over the very definition of the West. One side saw the land as a communal resource for the bold. The other saw it as a collection of private assets to be farmed and managed. But the wire was relentless. It carved the infinite landscape into manageable squares, choking the ancient migratory routes and ending the era of the free grass. The cowboy, once the master of the wilderness, found himself increasingly trapped in a maze of steel, his movements dictated by the property lines of men he had never met. But if the wire was the slow poison, the winter of 1886 was the sudden, violent blow. In the history of the West, it is known simply as the Big Die. The summer of 1886 had been unusually hot and dry, leaving the cattle weakened and the grass scorched. When the first blizzards arrived in November, they were followed by a series of unprecedented Arctic blasts that sent temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero. For weeks, the plains were transformed into a white, swirling purgatory. The cattle, following their natural instinct to drift before a storm, found themselves trapped against the newly erected barbed wire fences, unable to move forward and unable to find shelter. Millions of animals froze where they stood, stacked against the wire in gruesome walls of ice and fur. The cowboys of that winter faced a horror that no amount of grit could overcome. They watched helplessly as their herds were decimated. The stories from that season are haunting. Men losing their way between the house and the barn and freezing to death just yards from safety. And the eerie silence of a landscape where the only sound was the howling wind. When the spring thaws finally came, the reality was devastating. In some regions, 90% of the cattle were gone. The rivers were choked with carcasses, and the stench of death hung over the prairies for months. The financial loss broke the great cattle syndicates and ended the era of the massive, speculative ranching boom. The romantic image of the West was buried under the drifts of that terrible winter, and when the sun finally warmed the earth again, the world was different. The aftermath of the Big Die Up forced a radical reorganization of the industry. The survivors realized that they could no longer rely on the whims of nature. Ranching became an industrialized business. Cattle were now kept in smaller, fenced pastures where they could be provided with supplemental hay and water during the winter. This meant that the role of the cowboy had to change. The rider who had spent his life in the saddle, moving thousands of head across hundreds of miles, was now expected to spend his days digging post holes, stringing wire, and cutting hay with a scythe. The Knight of the Plains was becoming a farmhand on horseback. The prestige of the work began to erode as the independence of the trail was replaced by the routine of the ranch. This transition was a profound psychological blow to the men who had defined themselves by their mobility. Many of the older hands, unable to adjust to the confinement of the fenced ranch, drifted away, becoming legends in their own time or disappearing into the growing cities. The Code of the West was being overwritten by the ledger books of accountants. Efficiency replaced adventure. The cattle were now shipped on shorter, more controlled routes to local railheads that had reached into every corner of the territory. The Great Trails, the Chisholm and the Western, were being reclaimed by the plow. The dust of the long drive was settling for the last time, and the silence that returned to the prairie was no longer the silence of the untouched wild, but the quiet of a landscape that had been mastered and subdivided. Yet, even as the physical reality of the open range vanished, the cultural obsession with it was just beginning to explode. while the actual cowboys were fixing fences and nursing sick calves in the mud. The public in the East and in Europe was consuming a sanitized, heroic version of their lives. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and the first Western novels began to turn the working-class laborer into a mythological figure. The irony was sharp. The more the real cowboy faded into the background of industrial agriculture, the more the fictional cowboy loomed over the world's imagination. The world wanted the legend, not the reality of the man with the frozen fingers and the broken spirit. By the dawn of the 1890s, the frontier was officially declared closed. The map of the United States was now a solid block of territories and states, with no unorganized spaces left. The cowboy had been the advance guard of this expansion, the bridge between the unknown and the settled. He had done his job so well that he had made himself obsolete. The iron rail and the barbed wire had won. But as the last of the open-range riders looked out over the fenced horizon, they carried with them a memory of a time when the world felt infinite. They were the last witnesses to a specific kind of freedom. A brutal, lonely, and beautiful freedom that would never be seen again. The era was over, but the ghost of the rider remained, etched into the dirt and the psyche of a nation that was already beginning to miss the very wilderness it had fought so hard to conquer. The dust of the great cattle drives has long since settled, and the thunderous roar of the million hoofed herds has faded into a ghostly whisper. Yet the figure of the cowboy refuses to vanish from the human heart. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a remarkable transformation occurred. The cowboy did not simply retire into the pages of history. He ascended into the realm of myth. The man who was once a salt-crusted, overworked seasonal laborer was reborn as a universal symbol of independence, courage, and the untamed spirit. This final evolution was not dictated by the demands of the ranch, but by the power of the storyteller. From the traveling circuses of Buffalo Bill Cody to the flickering frames of the first silent films, the world began to consume a version of the West that was more about the soul than the saddle. The cowboy became the quintessential American hero, a figure standing at the crossroads of civilization and the wild, eternally guarding the boundary between order and freedom. Early cinema found its perfect subject in the West. In the vast, sweeping landscapes and the high-stakes morality of the frontier, filmmakers discovered a canvas for the human condition. Actors like John Wayne and Gary Cooper replaced the wary trail hands in the public consciousness, projecting an image of the cowboy as a man of few words and decisive action. While these portrayals often polished away the grit, the diversity, and the sheer drudgery of the actual job, they captured an essential truth about the cowboy's appeal. He represented the ultimate escape from the suffocating complexities of modern life. In a world of growing bureaucracies, rising skyscrapers, and industrial noise, the cowboy offered a return to a simpler, albeit harsher, reality. He was the man who could ride away from his problems, a figure whose only master was the horizon. This cinematic legacy turned the American West into a global heritage, making the cowboy as recognizable in the streets of Tokyo or Paris as he was in the heart of Texas. Yet, beyond the glitz of Hollywood and the romanticism of the campfire songs, the real cowboy never truly went away. The industry simply adapted to the rhythms of a new age. Today, across the high plains of Wyoming, the brush country of Texas, and the rugged hills of Montana, the working cowboy remains a vital part of the American economy. The horse has been joined by the pickup truck and the ATV, and the lariat is now often used alongside satellite tracking and modern veterinary science. But the core of the work remains unchanged. It is still a life dictated by the needs of the animal and the whims of the weather. The modern ranch hand still faces the biting cold of the winter calving season and the relentless heat of the summer roundup. The tools have evolved, but the character required to endure the life remains the same. A quiet stoicism, a deep respect for the land, and a bond with the animal kingdom that most of the modern world has long since forgotten. The spirit of the trail also found a new home in the arena of the rodeo. What began as informal competitions between rival outfits at the end of a drive evolved into a world-class sport, preserving the skills of the 19th century as a form of high-stakes performance. In the grit of the rodeo ring, the art of bronc riding, calf roping, and bull riding keeps the memory of the open range alive. Here, the tension between man and beast is celebrated as a testament to human skill and animal power. The rodeo is more than just entertainment. It is a living museum, a place where the traditions of the vaquero and the trail hand are passed down to new generations. It serves as a reminder that the cowboy way of life was built on a foundation of tangible skills, physical bravery, and a competitive spirit that defined the frontier. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the cowboy is found not in his work or his sports, but in the code of the West that continues to influence the modern psyche. In an era of constant connectivity and shifting values, the idea of the cowboy represents a grounded moral compass. It is the belief that a man's word is his bond, that loyalty to one's outfit is paramount, and that true strength is found in silence and perseverance. This cultural DNA has seeped into every aspect of life, from leadership philosophies to the way we view the relationship between the individual and the state. The cowboy remains the ultimate outsider, the one who walks his own path and lives by his own rules. He is the reminder that, even in a world that is fully mapped and fenced, the human spirit still craves a frontier, As we look back over the long, dusty road from the first Spanish missions to the modern ranch, we see a story of incredible resilience. The cowboy was born from the wreckage of war, shaped by a landscape that tried to kill him, and immortalized by a world that needed a hero. He was a man of many faces, black, white, brown, and indigenous, all joined by the shared language of the trail. His era was brief, a mere heartbeat in the span of history, yet it left an indelible mark on the earth. The trails may be paved over, and the great herds may be gone, but the essence of the journey remains. It is a story of how humanity finds a way to belong in the most inhospitable of places, how we create culture out of necessity, and how we turn a job into a legend. The sun is setting now, casting long, purple shadows across the prairie, much as it did 160 years ago. If you listen closely, past the sound of the highways and the hum of the power lines, you can almost hear the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the gentle jingle of spurs. You can almost see the silhouette of a lone rider crested on a distant ridge, paused for a moment against the dying light. He is not a ghost, but a reflection of ourselves, of our desire for freedom, our capacity for endurance, and our eternal fascination with what lies beyond the next hill. The cowboy is the guardian of the horizon, a figure who reminds us that as long as there is a wild place left in the world, or a wild thought in the mind, the West will never truly be won. In the end, the story of the cowboy is the story of the American dream in its rawest, most unvarnished form. It is the dream of starting over, of testing one's limits, and of finding a sense of purpose in the vastness of the unknown. As we close this chapter of our journey, we realize that the cowboy does not belong to the past. He belongs to the future. He is the archetype of the survivor, the eternal traveler on the long drive of life. And as the stars begin to flicker over the plains, we know that somewhere out there, the fire is still burning, the coffee is still strong, and the trail is still calling. The legend gallops on, forever restless, forever free, and forever a part of the wind that sweeps across the great American West.